Well, it's been 7 months since the first reported cases of COVID-19 emerged in the Chinese city of Wuhan. Since then, the world has not been the same for most of us, but there have been pandemics before, and the one that resonates the most, perhaps, is the 1918 to 1919 Spanish flu outbreak that swept across the world. 100 years ago, it found its way all over the world via people who were traveling via sea. Now, today, it's traveled much faster because of the millions of intercontinental flights that were used before the lockdown. Professor Howard Phillips is Emeritus Professor at UCT and the author of, among other books, Plague, Pox and Pandemics. He joins me now. Professor, good evening, and thank you so much for your time tonight. I suppose it's only natural for individuals, especially those who are living through their first pandemic, to wonder what the historical record of such an occurrence is and whether or not there are lessons that can be drawn.
Kathy, hi, good evening, and good evening to your viewers. South Africa is no stranger to pandemics. There have been pandemics going back at least to the 18th century: smallpox, bubonic plague, Spanish flu, polio, and then most recently, before COVID-19, HIV/AIDS. And if one stands back from these pandemics, there are a number of patterns and trends which really begin to show themselves, and I think are probably applicable now in 2020 as well.
Let's talk about what some of those patterns and trends are.
Yeah, I think there are probably about 4 or 5 things that pandemics do, because what pandemics have in common, whatever their source, whether they're smallpox or polio or Spanish flu or coronavirus, they cause enormous fear about life and death. That's the nature of pandemics. They cause panic, they cause immense fear and almost terror. And the way in which humans respond in whichever society and in whichever time have certain commonalities. One of the things that pandemics do is that they reveal the underlying aspects of any society. They show up very sharply, disparities, inequality in societies. And we can see that very clearly demonstrated in COVID-19, but that's been true of every pandemic. The second thing that pandemics do is that they also reveal underlying attitudes and prejudices, because it's almost a standard human response in the face of a threatening epidemic to say, who's to blame? And inevitably the response is, they are to blame. It's someone else or some other group or some other country. And that really does reveal very clearly underlying prejudices and attitudes. There's perhaps a third thing that pandemics do. Pandemics also accelerate trends or patterns which perhaps were emerging slowly before an epidemic, which didn't really have momentum, which didn't really look as if they were going anywhere with particular speed. What pandemics do is accelerate these enormously. They take things which perhaps were slow moving and escalate the speed at which they happen.
And sure. You can continue with the final one. Go ahead, Prof.
Okay. I think the other thing that pandemics do is that they initiate. They start things which no one would have easily anticipated. They trigger responses which don't really seem to have been on the cards beforehand.
And of course, you know, all of these things that you're mentioning, we have seen traces of even in our own country. And the big question that South Africans have is around not just the fear of the moment and the, what it brings up around having to contend with death or dying, or even how that happens, but a conversation around recovery, being in what is said to be this deep economic turmoil that may last for however long it'll be with us for. People want to know if they will be able to recover. And when you look at some of the pandemics and, the health crises that have hit the country, what do the recovery rates of society look like? Well, how long does it take a society to get out of such a dip, if I can put it that way?
Kathy, that's a very difficult question to answer, because different pandemics have different periods of duration. The Spanish flu that you talked about right at the beginning was short, vicious, and